It's a tremendous pleasure to be with you and to welcome you to this special discussion. This is a project of the Digital Benefits Coalition, which is a brand new collaboration between Benefits Data Trust, Code for America, the Beck Center at Georgetown University, New America, and others who are coming together to solve one of the most critical challenges facing our nation. Benefits are essential to supporting America's families when they get into trouble, and also our broader economy when we encounter big challenges. And at the moment, as has been very evident over the last few months, certainly the course of the pandemic, benefit systems in the United States aren't working. They aren't getting the resources where they are needed. Families, in many cases, are waiting months and months for assistance to which they are entitled. And in too many instances, they are leaving our systems vulnerable to cyber attacks, and the resources that should be going into our communities are instead being diverted to those that have malintent. We are coming together as a coalition to try to fix this problem, and we're looking forward to today's conversation as a key stepping stone on a path that we hope is going to lead to greater accountability, efficiency, and accessibility for benefits for America's families. We are going to kick off with some great work that Dan Correa and his team have been engaged in. They are working together as part of the Day One project to ensure that the incoming administration has concrete policy proposals to fix this and other challenges, and they've just released a great report on this subject. So Dan, over to you. We're looking forward to hearing about that report, and then we will go into our first panel.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that introduction. We are delighted to be here. Again, my name is Dan Correa. I am the director of the Day One project. And just wanted to say a few words at the top about why we're so excited about this proposal, and just share a little bit of background on our process and how you can raise your hand to participate. So we've got a great conversation teed up, and this is truly the culmination of, for us, a bit of a vision. The Day One project is a nonpartisan nonprofit initiative dedicated to preparing an ambitious set of science, tech, and innovation policy ideas for action on day one of the next term. That's driven by the fundamental insight that the beginning of a new presidential term is a critical agenda-setting moment, and an opportunity for the community to help shape and inform ideas. And so those members of our team, the members of our team are former policymakers. And as former policymakers, we recognize that we typically don't have a monopoly on good ideas. So we built a project as a platform, an opportunity for members of the community and issue experts across science, innovation, and tech topics to contribute their ideas and to work with us and with policymakers to refine them into actionable proposals. And this reflects our core hypothesis of policymaking, which is that more often than not, any sort of policy action is driven by a smart, motivated policy entrepreneur who does the hard work of preparing an idea and doesn't take no for an answer. And so we put the policymaker at the center of the process, treat them as a customer with real needs and with real questions to be answered. So the proposal that we're going to talk about today by Adam Bobrow and Marcus Courtney isn't some 20-page policy memo that they arrived at through divine inspiration. Instead, they developed a fairly succinct proposal with key questions that they anticipated policymakers would have that they've addressed in advance, that reflects the kind of thing that a policymaker would actually receive and value and would be the starting point for a conversation. And so the thing that I want to share about this process and why we're so excited about the work that these two have done is that this short proposal represents a tremendous amount of iterative development, shopping their ideas, refining them with issue experts and former policymakers and current policymakers, and crafting a set of implementation pathways that has yielded the final product that we're so excited to share with you today on this urgent and critical issue. And so looking forward to jumping in. But before we do, I just want to share, if you have an idea that this process inspires you, and you have an idea for policy action that you would like to see embraced, we'd love to work with you. So you can contribute your idea at www.dayoneproject.org/ideas. And we will work with you to develop what begins as a kernel of an idea into a compelling proposal for policy action. So with that, about the Day One Project, let me turn it back to Tamika to take us through.
Thank you, Dan. And I know many of our participants today are looking forward to that report and digging in deeper on the great research that you and your team are engaged in. We have, to help us begin this process of excavation on what for many is a rather opaque topic, an absolutely all-star panel. And we are fortunate this is between our two panels today, we have, I think, cornered the market on talent in this space. We are hearing from the best of the best. We will begin with a question to Robin Carnahan, and I'm going to introduce each of our speakers as I call on them. Robin has a variety of titles. She is at the Beck Center at Georgetown University, where she's a fellow in data and digital. She's also, crucially for this conversation, the former Secretary of State of New Jersey, and has experience deploying really big, complicated technology programs in the public sector, and works with many states around the country that are seeking to benefit from that experience right now. Robin, when the pandemic hit, we had one of the biggest public assistance programs in U.S. history, the biggest public benefits injections in U.S. history take place. And there's almost universal agreement on all sides of the political spectrum that the system didn't work as it was supposed to. Things didn't function the way anybody would have wanted them to function. It is really hard to get universal opinion on anything in Washington these days. So I want to know what went wrong. How did we end up in the position that we're in, that everybody, regardless of where they are on the spectrum, is saying, yeah, we've got to do better here?
Well, thanks to Micah, and great question, but I've got to do one little correction before I get started, and that is the sign behind me indicates Missouri, not New Jersey, where I was Secretary of State.
New Jersey?
You did, and I
don't even
know where that came from.
I know that very well. We work with New Jersey a lot. We love New Jersey, and Beth Novick and her team are marvelous, but absolutely New Jersey.
They're fantastic. But wanted to set the record straight on that.
Glad you did. That deserves correction.
So what went wrong? Well, look, as you said, it was just this incredible sort of moment where the country did come together and policymakers passed the biggest package, $3 trillion, which is unbelievable, and did it with bipartisan support. And then Americans expected to get some relief from that. And all of a sudden that ground to a halt. And so you sort of dig out and figure out what happened here. And my shorthand version of that is the damn websites didn't work, right? Why do I say that? It's because you have to be able to implement policy. And nowadays, to implement policy, you have to have technology to support that. And in a situation where the federal government passed the policy, moved funding down to states and counties to implement that, being closer to their public, the technology systems and the digital infrastructure to be able to quickly pivot to new programs was just not in place. And it showed up over and over again. It caused Americans who really needed money and support in a time of a national pandemic, a global pandemic, to not have that support. And ultimately, just not having that digital infrastructure undermines people's trust in government's ability to work at the time that they need it. So it's really, really important.
So Trooper and Amanda, I'm going to ask you two to help us dig in a little bit deeper on this, because Robin is absolutely right. The systems didn't work the way they were supposed to. What at a mechanical level is not functioning here, and why are we in the situation that we're in? We've got very fragmented systems spread across many different states. There isn't a national standard, but what are the key problems in your eyes? Amanda, you're CEO of Code for America. You work, and your organization works with states all over the country that are trying to solve these problems. Trooper, you lead Benefits or Data Benefits Trust, which is trying to, again, build technology platforms that will enable individuals to get better access to benefits. What's going on here? Trooper, we'll start with you.
Sure. So everyone just take a second to think about how you feel right now. It's 2020. We're under a lot of pressure. We're fatigued. A lot of things are demanding our time and focus. Now let's just, for those of us of a certain generation, let's go back to the time when everyone raced to the bank before 5 o'clock on Friday so that they had money over the weekend. And maybe it was the first generation of the ATM, but frankly, you know, we sat there hoping that our card didn't get eaten and we were out of luck for a couple of weeks until we could get a new one in the mail. That is the experience of way too many people who need essential benefits for healthcare, for food, and just for basic essentials. And that's really been built off of decades of these programs that were really centered around rules and regulations as opposed to being centered around the customer and the client or the constituent. For those of you who work on the Hill, it would be as if your constituent service department was designed around the rules of the Social Security Act rather than the people who needed their Social Security check. And what that really means is it puts an enormous amount of strain and stress on people who need help, but it also puts a lot of strain and stress on public servants who show up every day wanting people to be able to get healthcare and food. And so the system really doesn't work for anybody. And there are very concrete steps to take, but it's a lot of work. One of the things, in addition to our technology work that we're doing at Benefits Data Trust, is we are trying to make the current system work better. And so for a number of people who are on unemployment, it is very difficult to then go apply for SNAP and healthcare and other benefits. And so we have people today who, if they can get their unemployment assistance and they're facing losing their benefits, don't have food assistance, don't have healthcare and other things because the system is really too difficult for your average person under stress to deal with that. And so we're trying to bridge that. But really, I would say if there's one message, it's let's make this system about the constituent and not the rules and regulations.
Great points. Amanda.
Yeah, to add to that, and Trooper, I really like the way you framed it, because I think we could all use a little bit of empathy and reminding folks this package was incredible. And the reason why it was so big is because there are so many folks out there who need services from government. And that part of it is really what Trooper is getting at. Some people call that in tech human-centered design, people-centered. I've heard that on the Hill. And I think that's a fundamental piece here. We will put in the chat the process that we have for the last 10 years in really helping government deliver services to some of our hardest to reach communities. And the reason I mention it is because, you know, this is work that we've been doing for a while, but not necessarily as much of a national discussion as certainly it is now, given everything that's happened. And so I just want to leave you with two things. Number one, in our delivery-driven principles is build equitable systems. And I say that because if the systems themselves from the very beginning were never reaching the people they were supposed to reach, it's not surprising that when we have a crisis and we want to push more resources through it, your outcomes don't change unless you fundamentally change something in that process. And so starting with the idea that we're building equitable systems is really important. And it's really come to light in this time in the pandemic when Black and brown communities, low income rural communities were really hard to reach. Unless we change something about that, we're never going to get the kind of outcomes we need. So one thing that we can do as we partner is make sure from the start we do that. And the second is really what Trooper said. How do you ensure that we are really thinking about the person who gets the services? The idea that food stamps or a desktop application or a paper application instead of mobile for years, you know, is crazy. Those are the kinds of things that we need to change. And I will say right now we have a real opportunity, and I worked on the Hill for almost a decade. I remember the change in administration. I know it feels a little bit weird right now, but when just fast forward to January, when we're moving in some direction and it's time to move together, and hopefully at that point we can, I remember on the Hill what it felt like to come together and start to say, okay, we have this window of opportunity when we're all together trying to solve a major problem. I think now's the time to look at things and say, how do we make sure these programs are centering people And how are we doing that in the new digital age? Because we can do it better so that it sees people, to Trooper's point, and it centers them as we think about these policy from a policy perspective and an implementation perspective.
So Amanda brings up a number of really wonderful points there. And the reality is these are really old systems. In many cases, they're 80-year-old systems that we are relying on to try and solve these challenges. And many of them have not been designed with the constituent in mind. They have not been designed to succeed, as Trooper was saying. How much of this can be solved with technology, and how much of this is a policy equation? And how should we think about that? Robin, can you give us a little bit of insight based on your experience?
Yeah, it's so interesting because we start this with the right intentions, right? And then things get layered on top, and none of those things tend to happen. Most things happen for rational reasons, and how these systems were set up reflect that. What we learned, however, was that they were set up for the wrong threat models. Like the threat that people were trying to stop and policymakers wanted to avoid was cheating, people over-claiming benefits. And so lots of protections were put in place to make sure that did not happen. And what we've seen during the pandemic is that the real threat of abuse here is from criminal fraud rings who have stolen identities that are available on the dark web and put claims in and bilked US taxpayers and government out of billions of dollars, while at the same time, the people who need the benefits have not been able to claim them because somebody has stolen their identity and done it instead. So that's the fundamental shift that we need to make here is how do we set these systems up so the people who we do intend to help and get these benefits are able to do that in a relatively easy, seamless way through digital tools, and the people who shouldn't get it are stopped. So it's sort of basic, and you would think that that would be done already, but it turns out it wasn't. And it reflects really decades of underinvestment in these kind of programs. And it's not just unemployment, but it's other public benefit programs. So it's time now, while we've got the attention of decision makers and the public on why this is important, to think about how do we create what I call a resilient digital infrastructure. Because unless we have that, you can't do public policy. Whatever they decide in Washington or in capitals, if it can't get implemented, it's as good as nothing for the person who needs to figure out how to feed their family. So to me, getting these digital tools right is fundamental to government being able to do its mission and to deliver for the public. And the good news is a lot of these are not technology problems because they've been solved in the private sector already. If you think about digital identity, which really is at the root of an awful lot of the causes of these problems, like the fraudster stole the identity, they put it in, the real person couldn't make the claim, it got into a backlog, they needed to make calls. And so we saw a situation where there were millions of people in these backlogs that were taking all of this, hundreds of thousands of hours of time of government staff to try to sort out who was due benefits. These are solved problems in the private sector. If you think about online banking or online mortgages or credit cards, these are solved problems. So I'm optimistic about this because the technology part's not the hard part. So that's solved. It's not even innovative. It's been done for decades. What we need to do is just apply it to these government services. And once we do, I think the public will be able to have access to terrific government digital services in the same way they get access to great commercial digital services. So that's what I look forward to.
So at risk of putting a fine point on this, Robin, my sister, who is not unemployed and who had not applied for any benefits, this week received 15 prepaid benefits cards, which were not the result of somebody overreaching on their application. It was a result of a very sophisticated cyber attack, a cyber criminal ring that got something wrong, and so the cards went to my sister as opposed to the criminal ring. But these are real issues that folks are running into, and you're absolutely right. We do have the wrong threat model out there. Trooper, how do we counter that? How do we change mindsets? We have folks joining us today from Capitol Hill and policymakers that are thinking about how to redesign these systems. What's your advice to them to get them in the right headspace so that we can get the resources to the constituents that need them and hopefully guard against some of the bad actors that are, unfortunately, proving very successful in their ability to penetrate systems that are incredibly cumbersome, but cumbersome for the wrong people, not cumbersome for the folks that are actually taking advantage of them to engage in bad acts.
Absolutely. So I think a few things. I think one is, let's think about your constituents and what you and your colleagues have heard from your constituents over time, but particularly this year, and the struggles that they have had, and really think about what is the system that we wish would have been in place on day one of this pandemic that would have served your constituents better, that would have perhaps made your members a bit less cranky because they're hearing from your constituents, and really grounded in what they need and also in what makes sense. You know, and I think, you know, as Robin said, a lot of these solutions from a technology point of view, from a process point of view, have been solved in other places. And so this is very practical work at scale. I think the other part is, you know, yes, we have an absolute importance to make sure that the public interest is met and that there aren't criminal activity going on, that we're not draining public resources in ways that shouldn't be there. But, you know, let's also think about this from the total bottom line perspective and what this has to do with the larger public interest. In BDT, we've done some research that looked at when seniors can get SNAP, it has a material impact on if they go into the hospital, how long they stay, because a better bag of groceries can make them healthier. And also that healthier seniors who have better bags of groceries to be more robust can delay the time that they go into nursing homes and care homes. And think about what that means. Before the pandemic, if we could make a meaningful difference in the number of seniors who go into nursing homes, often paid for by Medicare and Medicaid and socking the systems with those major costs, think about what we could do for healthcare and other things and relieving the pressure on our healthcare system. And now let's think about the pandemic, where nursing homes are the epicenter of infections and deaths to COVID-19. And it is extraordinary and it is unacceptable to think that if we had gotten at scale seniors eligible for SNAP a better bag of groceries a year or 2 years ago, that we could have a meaningful number of seniors at home fussing with their kids and grandkids about, no, you can't go to your like morning coffee hour on Monday, stay home, as opposed to what we're dealing with now. That is highly, highly motivating.
Or at least it should be. That's really encouraging to hear you say that, and very true. Amanda, I'm hoping you can help us unpack 2 points. One is something you mentioned in chat a little while ago, which is there were some temporary changes that were put in place around the pandemic that are in some cases moving things in the right direction. And there is a risk that those are going to stay just that, temporary changes, and they won't help to fundamentally restructure the system. So I'm hoping you can talk us through those a little bit. And the other piece is a question that came in from Natalie Wood, who's in the audience today, who asked about what we can do to help organizations identify clogs in the claims process. We're seeing in some cases that states only have approval rates for claims of 40%, which is just breathtaking under the circumstances. So I know your teams do a lot of work on this, but how do we identify what's not working and then hopefully make permanent some good solutions that have been implemented to streamline things?
Sure. So I want to take us to the first couple of months of the pandemic, and this question or conversation that Robin brought up about how we think about it. Because our systems are so worried about fraud, we require some of our lowest income communities who their kids are on food stamps or their kids are on the school lunch program, and all of a sudden schools are closed. what we would require these families to do is verify who they are by interviews. We actually make the folks who are having the toughest time figure out how to go into an office, figure out how to do an interview, take the time out of the job that they have that are holding on so tight in order to verify them. I mean, think about that. The folks who are having the hardest time, in order to get food assistance, you must tell me, show me who you are in a way that we don't require for so many other programs that reach other families. In the pandemic, the state started to realize perhaps this isn't a good idea, not only because of the pandemic, but perhaps just out of caring and understanding these families, that maybe this isn't the right process. And so in the state of California, they actually stopped those interviews as a verification process. That should just be the way we are. And so I think as we really understand this moment we're in, but we really understand policy as we go forward, let's talk about how do we make that permanent? There's another piece that happened during pandemic EBT where schools and states and social services were trying to figure out how to match data. In a moment of crisis and people were trying to get EBT cards out or get resources out for people to buy food, in some states, we saw a real willingness across the board to try and say, how can we match this data? If we had a federal policy or some kind of guidance from federal agencies, et cetera, to say, we're going to allow you to either push this data matching behind the scenes and or push some of these vendor contracts that really harm the ability, and particularly in crisis, to actually get that data or push systems together, that makes all the difference being able to reach people. So as Capitol Hill and we all think about policies as we go forward, let's take some of those temporary policies we made. It's an early, easy start because many of them worked, and we're happy to share how we saw them work and what kind of outcomes we got from them. On the idea of claims, part of what I think is so important about technology and having good systems is it allows you to see where it's working and where it's not working. We do hear from community-based organizations that we work with, hey, this didn't work, or we tried this and this didn't work, or we saw fraud here, or they could see certain things. But the minute you actually have good systems and you're doing things like data analytics behind it, you actually can see these rings pop up. It's easy to see them. Those feedback loops, if we can continue to have these feedback loops, are everything. And so, I'm sure there's other people who can add in here, but I want to make sure to be respectful of time.
So, Robin, when I have talked with smart folks on this, one of the things I often hear is that these are solved problems. We know these are solved problems. Other countries have done this. They've done this very well, and they don't have these issues. When the Canadians wanted to disperse their benefits, it took about 24 hours to do that, and it worked really smoothly. And there are many other countries we could point to around the world that have built these systems successfully. But to your argument earlier, the US doesn't have the type of resilient digital infrastructure that can facilitate that. And the reason folks previously, to Amanda's comment, were having to go and show up in those offices, which is crazy under the best of circumstances, it's triple crazy during a pandemic, is because we don't have good digital infrastructure in place to fix this stuff. You have told me in the past, and it's one of my favorite Robin quotes that I invoke frequently, that all governments have the same problems, but not necessarily at the same time. And yet right now, everyone is having those same problems at the same time. And so there's an opportunity to fix things there. What's different now that, what has shifted over the course of this year that should make us optimistic about solving these problems? How do you see dynamics moving in a way that give us a real chance to fix this stuff? Whereas previously, even smart people would say the US is just too fragmented, things are too messy, we're not going to be able to put these pieces together the way we want to.
So you have a lot in that question, and I want to address a couple of different pieces of it. One is like, why do other countries get able, or why are they able to do this with more ease than we are? Our system, I think, is unique in that we have this very, very federal strong system where we push a lot of activities and responsibilities for implementation to states and localities. That's different than most of the rest of the world. One of the other big differences is we don't have a national identity card. And almost all other countries in the world have that, where as a citizen of the country, there is some identity. They can, in many places now, tie that to a digital identity. And once you've solved the identity problem and the verification of identity problem, that's like 3/4 of the way there in terms of making sure you can get benefits out to the right people. So those are two challenges that we have in the United States that I think are unique. Why am I optimistic that we can get this done now? I think that there's been so much attention focused on this in the last 8 or 9 months that systems that have been easy to ignore for legislators, for executives, for members of Congress. Often when you have the poor in our society as the ones who are the beneficiaries of these programs, they're not the ones that are picking up the phone and calling their members of Congress all the time. But in this pandemic, when we had so many people unemployed and relying on these benefits, they are going to pick up their phones and make those calls and complain because they expect their government to deliver. And so I think it's gotten on the agenda in a new way. So that's a good thing. I also think that we're in a different place when it comes to technology development. You know, in the past, when many of these systems were put in place, you know, bless them, there were these COBOL legacy things. They've worked well at the time, but times have changed and the way people develop technology tools has completely changed. And so the need for states to have one-off, very unique, snowflakey, just built bespoke for them systems is no more. We can have very modular pieces of functionality that are basically the same for any state. In fact, one of the ideas that I would like to talk about at some point today is leveraging existing federal resources to do some of these identity checks. I mean, if you think about the CMS Data Hub, for example, where you have the Affordable Care Act, where no matter where you are in the United States, you can go on a website, put in information about yourself, that gets verified and checked, and then it will send you to a state website to figure out what your plan is for that state. That same kind of model where you use a unified or federal identity service and have that available for states to be able to use could solve a huge problem, right? That now we have 50 states out there reinventing the wheel on their own. And that's a lot of cost and that's a lot of time and delay. And I guess one other thing I would say in that is when we're having these situations where there are new federal policies that are put in place, it's much easier if the federal policy and regulation that gets put out is not just delivered in English language to the states to then hand over to their IT departments to translate into computer code to be able to then work for the applicant and for their staff, that if the federal agencies could deliver that regulation as computer code, right, for this new system, the ability to like stand that up and implement is dramatically different for states. So I know that sounds a little bit nerdy, but that's the future of how we're going to make these public benefits and all government services work better.
Trooper, help us dig in on this, and I'm going to ask Amanda for help on this in a moment as well. We have this amazing concept now that didn't really exist in the public sector, even though it was already a thing 20 years ago, called open source code. And the idea behind open source code is that you can build something, you can hardwire in a lot of the accountability, efficiency, transparency that you would hope to, and then make that code available to different communities that can customize it to meet the specific needs that they may have within their little part of the country. How can that possibility help us get ahead of this? And again, I think Robin is absolutely right. There is so much duplication. There is so much fragmentation in the way these problems are solved right now. How do we shift to a more sane way of solving this challenge for Americans?
Well, I think there are a couple things. I think first, it's a question of leadership. There needs to be a decision made, a political decision made that we are going to go in a new direction, that we are going to take this path. And then for the officials and leaders who have to implement that. It's really a question of what are the incentives and enablement that they have to do the work, and recognizing that, you know, the folks who are working on different benefits programs and are providing leadership have so many other things to do, critical things to do. So what are the incentives? What are the tools? How do you ease the way so that the limited time and resources they have to spend with something like this makes sense? And then really, I think the third part, and you know I keep going back to this, is really what is the cold-eyed self-interest for the nation and for our constituents in making this move? And let's just put a hard truth on the table. For too long, when we talk about benefits, it's about them versus us. And I suspect that, you know, most folks participating in this event have some relative privilege to people who need benefits now, or who may, you know, live more on the economic edge. And really, I see the work that we have to do around our benefit system today and in the future as really about all of us. Yes, it's for people who today need food, need healthcare, need to heat their home, but it's also for the folks who during this year have driven by those lines, the food pantry lines, and have said, there but for grace go I, and who may be one paycheck and one job away. But then there's a third group. And look, while we hopefully recover and get out of this pandemic and this economic shock, we are still in the middle of a storm of fundamental economic change in the United States, with automation and other things that's really gonna touch many of our careers. And so even if you're doing well today, or your constituents are doing well today, they're one process change, automation, shift in the economy away from having to make a fundamental shift in their careers that could take years. And so we really need to make the decision to build the kind of benefit system that is going to be there for people who need it today, but that could be there and in a better way for all of us tomorrow. Because if we've learned anything from 2020, it's that life comes at you fast and hard and stuff happens.
So Trooper brings up a wonderful point, Amanda, and this is something that was reinforced a few days, weeks ago in a message I traded with Kevin O'Neill at the Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of our great partners in the Digital Benefits Coalition. We are seeing public attitudes toward benefits as a whole shift pretty significantly as a result of the pandemic. And all of a sudden, people are understanding, oh, this isn't just us versus them. This could happen to anybody. And if it can happen to anybody, then we really need to make sure these systems work well. Arguably, we should have been doing that for a long time, but you know, let's take what we've got, which is that the mindset is moving in a more constructive direction. How do you and Code for America believe we can work with leaders in government to build that foundation, not only around unemployment insurance, for all of our benefits? How can we reimagine this space going forward, to Trooper's point, to ensure that we have the digital infrastructure in place that will offer all Americans a degree of resilience in these systems, so that regardless of what comes at us, our institutions can respond effectively when crisis strikes?
A couple of things. Number one, I'm honored to be on this panel with people who've been doing this work for a really long time. So part of the message here is that, yes, a lot of folks might not have been paying attention to what is happening in this space, but there's a whole heck of a lot of nonprofits, academics, people who have been not only thinking about it, but really in the space trying to help, whether it's our brigades, our 85 brigades around the country who step in when there's a crisis, or who figure out how to asset map, or to figure out why the website doesn't quite work to reach people. You know, everyone on this call who is in this space has been seeing what's working and what's not working. So first, I would add to what Trooper said and really add to this discussion that there's an opportunity here to take the best practices that are out there now. The end of 2019, we put a 50-state analysis of SNAP, TANF, and Medicaid. And where does every state fall into that category? We're working on a scorecard now, but the ability to take what we call our 50-state experiment and say what has been happening and how do we draw out the best practices and then utilize that. And I say that because I want to actually really lean into the idea that we have some systems, some public servants who have stepped up, some administrators who have stepped up and said, let's try it. Let's pilot this. Let's see if this can work. We can start there in terms of building public servants and recognizing that those folks who are on the Hill or are sitting in these agencies are trying to really do great work. And in some instances, we've broken through. So let's start from those best practices and share them across the board. And I think that would make a huge difference. And there's no doubt in the last 7 months, a lot of folks have stepped into that space. And now's a good time to take a step back, come together, and actually build some best practice policies together.
So, Robin, when we have looked at the numbers with Treasury, and this goes way beyond not only unemployment insurance, but benefits as a whole, the United States government, by its own admission, makes $170 billion a year in improper payments. Even by Washington standards, that is a lot of money. That is a whole lot of money. And most of that is not fraud. Most of that is just the fact that we have systems that don't function the way systems should in the 21st century. So I'm hoping you can help us do two things as we come to a close now. The first is to put policymakers in a place where they can understand the benefits of solving these problems. And we're going to drop a one-pager into the chat right now, which is a joint project of the Digital Benefits Coalition that lays out some of these arguments. But we're suggesting take a little fraction of the money that we're putting into benefits and a fraction of the money that is lost to these systems and invest in solutions. But do that in a different way. Don't just go back to the old mechanisms that have brought us to this point. So what is something that a policymaker should leave this conversation thinking about that they can do differently in order to bring us hopefully to a better spot in the not distant future on this? And we'll go to Trooper and Amanda and probably close out on that note.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Amanda, do you want to
go? Sorry, Robin, you go first, then Trooper
okay.
and Amanda will close out with you.
Okay, okay, great. So yeah. What can policymakers do? I think they can do a lot. The good news, as we've said here, is the technology part of this, which people often think is the blocker and the really hard magical thing that is impossible to deal with. It's not the blocker. Like, we have a lot of smart people who can figure out the technology piece. In the federal government, the U.S. Digital Service Team is fantastic. They've dug into a lot of these issues. 18F has worked across agencies on many of these issues and with states. There are many state digital service teams. They know what the technical opportunities are. So as Amanda said, we need to learn from those folks, have them at the table with policymakers as they're making policy decisions. We have to think differently about funding. I always say, one of my other adages is that states and counties and cities will do anything to get federal money because it's easier than going to their legislature and asking for a tax increase. So the federal government's ability to, with incentives of funding and incentives of less red tape, ease of access to the money, can completely transform the marketplace for this technology if they choose to. So policymakers can help with that by having funding incentives tied to best practices in technology delivery. Simple as that. That could be reusability, that could be open source tools, that could be, really importantly, policymakers, is not to think of these projects as big capital expenditures like building a bridge, as we've done many times in the past, that you just put your $100 million in and then patch it up for the next 30 years. That's how we've built technology. That's not how to do it going forward. Going forward, we need smaller amounts of very predictable funding so there can be constant improvements every year in response to the things that users need. The good news about that is it's cheaper. The bad news is it takes some of the power out of appropriators, it should, and into the hands of implementers to say, if you deliver a thing of value, you get more money and don't have to wait 2 or 3 years in a funding cycle to get that. So changing the way these projects are funded to incentivize and to reflect how technology is the reality going forward and needs to be an operating expense is really important. I guess the last point I would make is that we need to invest in tech talent, not just the federal level, but also at the state and local level. If we're going to continue to rely on them to implement these programs, let's not throw the policy out there and say, oh, the states are going to just implement this and think it's going to turn out. We've learned it's not going to turn out. We've learned that we've got to help them have the technology teams in place to get this done. And if we could invest, as you said, a fraction of the amount that we put into these big projects in thinking about the implementation of that at the state and local level, it changes everything in terms of both the outcome for the public, but also the cost to the taxpayers. So I think this is a great panel. Thanks for having me. But policymakers out there, this is a moment to step up and think a little bit differently about this. And just remember, it doesn't have to cost more money. It just has to be smarter money.
Fantastic. Trooper.
I would just like to pick up on the metaphor that Robin used of moving away from the capital expenditure or capital project mindset and really taking a constituent mindset. And that means not only with the technology, but all of the things that wrap around ensuring that it can be used well. And so that could be incentives for process improvements. It could be easing things such as Amanda mentioned, on data sharing, all of the pieces around that. And then really think about, what are the incentives that the folks in your states and in your districts who are running these programs and managing them will have to execute to high standard so that your constituents have a better experience. If we think in those terms, we can really see some fundamental improvements, not only in how government works and how these benefit systems operate at scale, but really finally see the value of these benefits programs to begin with realize themselves at scale, be it for health, be it for education outcomes or other things. And ultimately, to pick up on what Robin said, that is a smarter use of taxpayer dollars and the best use.
Fantastic. And Amanda, bring us home, please.
I will. This is hard to do with such great knowledge and folks who are on this panel. I love it. And it's hard. I want to bring us to the idea of we are what we measure. We spend a whole heck of a lot of time talking about what our fraud metrics are. And we spend zero time talking about the gap of the kids who are still hungry because we haven't reached them. Or the folks who are using earned income tax credit, and there's a $12 billion gap to get to working families that we're not finding them. To the extent that you're talking about what's happening in your state or in this country, if we could lead with this idea for the next generation that we are actually trying to reach every single kid that's hungry or that could go hungry, especially in a crisis. And we are trying to reach every single working family so that they have the resources they need. That will be the kind of government that I think we could all be proud of. And we have a long way to go, but if we can actually center on what we are measuring, and you can put these things in policy, what are the outcomes of this policy? Did they solve the gap? I think we'd be better for it.
Well, all four of the organizations represented on this panel, and I'm honored to be among them, the Beck Center, Benefits Data Trust, Code for America, and the Digital Impact and Governance Initiative at New America, are all trying really hard to solve this problem. We are fortunate to work with great organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation that I mentioned, who are all, I think, keenly aware of both the stakes and the opportunity if we get this right. We could not have had a better conversation to set the table for Corey Zarek and her great panel after this on what's going to be required at a mechanical level to do this. But let me extend my profound thanks, Robin, Trooper, Amanda. This has been marvelous, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you and many of our policymaker participants in the months and years ahead as the new administration takes over. Corey, over to you.
Thanks to Micah, and thanks for leading a great discussion with so many of our amazing collaborators. We're going to shift gears and dive deeper into the issues of unemployment insurance specifically. And I'm delighted to welcome some folks who, in addition to our previous group, have been spending their time both researching and carrying out work to consider a new way forward for unemployment insurance. First, though, I'm joining you from the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. At the Beck Center, we bring together practitioners and field leaders who are using data, design, and technology to solve big problems in society. We are proud to be part of the coalition that includes a whole host of groups and individuals working for a better state for benefits, access, and administration. And as we've seen in recent headlines, unemployment insurance is one that is top of mind for a lot of us around the country. So we want to talk about that over the next 40 minutes or so. And we are all working toward a reimagined future state. And I'll ask folks to continue dropping questions into the chat. I'll be monitoring those as we move along through the various speakers that we have here today, who I will introduce as we go. First up is Adam Bobrow, who spent the last few months digging into what a roadmap for the future of unemployment insurance could look like from a policy perspective. Adam co-authored a recent policy paper sharing recommendations for the incoming Biden administration. You heard Dan Correa preview that at the very top of our event today. Adam's background was leading federal policy work from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He's also worked in the Department of Commerce and the Patent and Trademark Office. So he's seen policy developments from a number of angles on the inside. Adam, what does the policy play look like here for the future of unemployment insurance?
Thanks, Corey, and thanks to all of our sponsors, as well as my co-author on this paper, Marcus Courtney. Marcus brought a lot of expertise in the area of labor and employment, and that helped give us a real sense. I also want to take just a moment to do a special shout out for Day One and Dan's points at the top. He mentioned that it was an iterative process to come up with this, and that's what they encourage. That's a lot more than lip service. We went through a long process, Marcus and I, I want to say a long process, but a very fruitful process of tapping into people's networks and really understanding and learning new things about how these problems can be addressed. And so even for somebody like me who spent a lot of time working on policy, I really would encourage anyone who's listening to this to think seriously about submitting an idea to Day One, as Dan suggested, and being prepared to roll your sleeves up, do the work, and get involved. So I think the previous panel was a terrific framing for this discussion, right? The problem here is both a supply problem, but it's also a pipeline problem. We're going into another round of lockdowns. We're likely to see more layoffs, and we'll see more strain on the unemployment insurance systems that exist in the states. But the funding battle and the potential expansion of benefits, or a return to those expansion of benefits, should not overshadow the fact that the delivery systems have failed recipients in too many ways. So to speak specifically about our paper, we talk about executive action that can take place by President Biden on Day One. And I think it's important to understand why, when these systems are thought of as state systems for delivering unemployment insurance, why federal government? And since we're talking about dispersing money, why the executive branch and not Congress? States administer the systems, the federal government provides so much of the money. And as Robin said in the last panel, incentivizing states is something that can be done fairly easily. But already a lot of federal money in these systems. As a result, the state government really will respond to the federal government's direction and the incentivization rules that apply. And you can use that to push forward changes in the state system. Similarly, in the executive, while Congress is appropriating the funds, the executive is in the position to advance the work of digital services groups in the at the state level by requiring that as a condition of getting the information. So it really is something that I think should be right at the top of President Biden's inbox on Day One. That executive action can have an immediate impact to address this technical problem with the delivery of benefits and really help people who are in need.
Thanks, Adam. And just while we have you, Could I ask you to just unpack a little bit more about what those steps would entail and where specifically the federal government can play, and agencies and an incoming administration can play roles to set all of these things from the inbox to the outbox on day one and beyond?
Of course. So I think we hear this very clearly from the previous panel, and I'm sure that Alberto and Alyssa will add to that. But digital services really provides the opportunity to streamline these services and make them scalable at the state level. And by conditioning some of the federal money that would go to the states on the implementation of digital services teams, you can improve the delivery systems in the states in a way where best practices can be shared from one state to another, where outdated systems can be updated, trusted technology providers can be identified, especially for, I mean, as we heard in the last panel, the identity and verification process is a big deal. One of the things that we reflected on in developing this paper was the fact that USDS, the US Digital Services Group, was something of an outgrowth of a rescue effort in the Obama administration to fix healthcare.gov. And healthcare.gov is a federal data portal. Fundamentally, it allows the state level exchanges to function, and the insight there, which has been replicated now in more other portals that are probably less well known, but for Social Security benefits and for veterans benefits, among others, could be I won't say easily, but could be replicated in a situation. And so a federal effort could be partnered with this effort to increase digital services at the state level, which would provide, either through a trusted technology partner or through the federal government databases, where that information is in those government databases, to allow for identity verification and other forms of data calls that could be done in a secure way to the federal government portal that would allow for significant streamlining of the delivery system.
Thanks, that's great. And what I'm hearing under the surface there is the federal government has a role to play, but this is going to be a huge ecosystem play. And we're going to need organizations and vendors and companies, you referenced trusted tech providers, as well as advocates and experts from inside and outside of government. I'm going to come next to you, Alberto. Alberto Rodriguez is with New America. He's a senior program manager, and he's been active with the New Practice Lab, which he'll tell us more about. It's a new effort at New America to lead work at the intersection of ideas and experimentation to improve the design and delivery of policies, particularly focused on families and making sure that they're set up for economic security and living their best lives. Alberto, tell us a little bit more about the work at the New Practice Lab, specifically around unemployment insurance. You've had a number of projects that have kicked off over the last few months, and I think you're really focused on both understanding the data and the baselines of where we are, as well as the inequities, particularly in Black and Brown communities. So what have you learned from this work? What are some of the recommendations that New America is putting out? And kind of, if we're thinking about this as an ecosystem play, where can organizations like New America step in?
Thank you, Corey. And just before that, let me just walk you through like two projects that we've been leading from the New Practice Lab with other organizations. The first one is the data dashboard. This is the unemployment insurance data dashboard that we built with the Century Foundation and other leading experts on unemployment, including the National Employment Law Project, Employ America, Community Legal Service, and a few other people that helped us build this data dashboard where we've been focusing on surfacing unemployment insurance data in ways that we can help state and federal leaders understand how they effectively take action. In the dashboard, we highlight how long does getting UI take? How many people are getting UI? Who is getting UI? And who is at risk of losing it? This dashboard is uploaded every Thursday and every month, so that we have the latest information there. And that is just a way that we can use data and technology just to understand the questions in the top level. But on the New Practice Lab, we're also looking at from the bottom up. And this other project that I'm talking about is the UI report that we published. It's over the course of 8 weeks over the summer, we interviewed Black and Latino workers that lost their jobs or income due to COVID-19. And we asked them about their experiences navigating unemployment insurance and specifically the digital systems that they used. That work led us on a journey of exploring more deeply how we could center racial equity in our practice of public interest tech, and not just in UI, but holistically. This work led us to find that UI is rife with compounding inequities, as we're calling them. And decision makers and subject matter experts would do well to cross-pollinate with experts in other areas, even and especially when they seem entirely unrelated, because they are not. It was designed that way. And there are many opportunities for technology to be helpful in increasing access to critical benefits, as the Day One project says. But it's also, at the same time, it's the role of technology in government-related work it should be scrutinized. Tech is a tool and it's not a solution. And sometimes when we build these tools with racial bias, they will output racial biased products. And if we want to invest in these tools in a broad way from the federal level on or in the state level, we should be focusing on building them with a racial equity, even framework, or just bringing all of the users into the table when we do.
Thanks, Alberto. And with this work, and we can dig up that report link and be sure to share it in the chat. But with this work that the New Practice Lab has been leading, and there we go, I see we have our slides. So, and maybe Alberto, if there was anything in the slides you wanted to touch on now that we have them, we can come back to you on that as well. But just curious on the role of the New Practice Lab and where it may come in going forward as we see a new federal administration come in, and as we have an opportunity for states and local governments as well to kind of get reoriented with a new way forward, perhaps taking some cues from the Day One paper and other policy proposals. How can the New Practice Lab continue to be a partner in highlighting some of the needs here?
Well, most of our work right now is building up on this design sprints. And when we partner with federal and state organizations, and we go deep into one of the other processes, we are focusing right now on EITC specifically to understand what are the blockers for users. But as we dive into all those policy processes, we actually surface really good insights on how to prep for a good understanding of the delivery portion of the policy, but also on the design part. And when we start asking really quick questions and basic questions that sometimes are not being asked in the table where policy is made, such as who is it really affecting? How is it really affecting? And how is a piece of technology that we're building is going to affect people that are, for example, not connected to the internet, or they have only connectivity through old even cell phones or sometimes old computers with a low bandwidth. That and understanding those relationships and also building up on the sprints can be a really good way to either the state governments and the federal governments to build up on their future technology projects.
Great, thanks. Yes, and those are incredible skills to bring to the table, and teams like U.S. Digital Service and 18F bring a lot of that to the federal government. We've got a lot of growing support for this type of work in state and local governments as well, but it's always critical to have these civic tech and public interest technology partners. So good to hear more about that. And speaking of, one of the newest civic tech and public interest technology partners is an organization called U.S. Digital Response. Alyssa Levitz is one of the newest team members at U.S. Digital Response, which formed at the start of the pandemic to provide targeted, time-bound support to governments as they navigate crises such as this pandemic or other emergencies that come up. So Alyssa, U.S. Digital Response has been very busy with unemployment insurance issues throughout the states. And I was hoping you could tell us about some of the unemployment insurance projects and partnerships that USDR has been involved with, and just what you're seeing, what the organization is seeing and learning as you navigate this in partnership with states that can inform where we should go in the future to both align priorities and avoid some of these failures.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. As Corey said, my name is Alyssa and I'm with US Digital Response, or USDR. And it was originally founded, as Corey said, to respond to the crisis very quickly with projects that could be done in a matter of days or even weeks. But as 2020 progressed, we were starting to realize the ways in which the crisis has brought certain problems to the forefront that have always existed in the system. And in unemployment insurance, that is certainly one of the areas where problems of scaling with need have always been there. So every state, for example, has periods of the year where if they have seasonal unemployment through retail or through agriculture, every year they get a backlog that queues up. And then it's just kind of understood like, oh, in this agricultural state, October is when this queue really starts to pile up. And then we just get through it by November and everything's okay again. But in the COVID era, realizing those backlogs are huge. And the reasons for those backlogs are not unique. To what Robin and Tamika were saying, like, governments all have the same problem, but not necessarily at the same time. Right now, it is at the same time. These problems of unemployment insurance backlogs are primarily around identity verification. So being able to understand who someone is and if they are the real person that they say they are. So if someone is presenting a real identity, but it isn't theirs, that is the threat model that these systems need to update to understand. And with identity verification, we are seeing some states already implement new solutions, but one of the ways in which US Digital Response is working is actually trying to understand the entire vendor landscape, because this is not something that is an unsolved problem in the tech world. And so wanting to see what is out there and the different things that can help state agencies support a better user experience. And as we are digging in, we are seeing that, as many of the panelists have talked about so far, the idea of a claimant-focused experience, a user-focused experience, a way of centering people, that is critically important to these systems that were built a really long time ago with, as Robin said, like kind of the best of what they had. And these systems have been starved of money for so long. And so US Digital Response has been able to help different states understand kind of where these problems are occurring upstream. So when you have an identity verification problem, sometimes that comes from data that the person claiming unemployment benefits has put in. But another constituent in this process is the employers themselves. So a lot of data that these systems rely on comes from employers who need to say how much they paid employees, whether they laid off employees, and that experience has also been starved of resources. So USDR has had the opportunity to kind of see these issues across a number of states and try to bring forward what we hope will be useful information for multiple states and to like bring forward those best practices.
Thanks, that's great. I want to stay on identity verification for a moment, and also on the considerations for working with trusted tech providers and vendors who are such an important part of this ecosystem and every service delivery ecosystem. One thing we used to say, especially as new teams in government came up, like the U.S. Digital Service and 18F at the federal level, and then in state and local teams, no matter how many incredible technologists we surface and bring into government, we are not going to build our way to solutions for all of these needs. We will need to always be partnering with companies and vendors. And so On the issue of identity verification, we had a question from Monica in the audience asking, we know this is a huge problem right now, and it's also one of those issues that can translate across systems. So the issue of identity verification, while critical for unemployment insurance, is critical for lots of other services. So what have you learned, Alyssa, in the USDR landscape scan of what's going on with vendors, and who's solved this? Are there any states, are there any governments that have found a good partner and kind of a trusted provider who they can work with, who can help states right now?
Yeah, so there are a number of vendors that have already been working with state unemployment insurance agencies in terms of helping them solve this identity verification issue, both before and notably since COVID began. I think one of the things there where you again have to look at the incentive structure of the system is with these vendors, they are having individual relationships and individual contracts with the different agencies. And so when we think about solving this problem once instead of 54 times, I think it is the number of unemployment insurance agencies in the US landscape, maybe 57. But when you think about solving it once, there has to be, that's something that would have to come from a more federal level in terms of understanding. And as Adam was talking about, that federal data portal or identity verification, there is a product through login.gov that provides a lot of that, but would require all of these agencies to update the way that people log into their system. So that's a really big lift. And if you want that centralized, that federalized way of identifying someone is who they say they are and is at the income level they say they are, which means they qualify for benefits X, Y, and Z, then that is something that you kind of have to think about from the top down a little bit more than on a vendor by vendor basis. The other thing to think about here is that as you are moving if that is a goal you would like to move toward, which I believe we should, again, we don't need to solve this problem 54 times. One of the other things you can think about is how other pieces might fit into that system. And with that is helping people understand what benefits they are in fact eligible for. And so going through, you have to know a benefit exists, you have to make it through their application process, whether it's an interview, sending in your tax forms to agency A and agency B and agency C. It's not just about having the same identity across, but all of those other pieces that connect to different social services that help you get access to that. And so Missouri is a state that recently put out a report on how they were talking specifically about SNAP and healthcare and Medicare, Medicaid benefits within their state. Unemployment insurance was not a piece of that picture, but how can they unify applications and processes across, I think it was like 4 different programs. And so with that, that is the direction we want to go, where people are able to get through these things easily and quickly without as much red tape.
Thanks, that's helpful. And just one more quick follow-up, and then Adam, I want to come to you to ask another question about the kind of federal policy approach with regard to vendors and partners. Alyssa, with USDR's work in evaluating and assessing these different outcomes, whether it's login.gov, public kind of free and open source version of identity verification, or something that a private company may have developed. Has USDR published anything, put anything out to kind of show what you found? Is that in the plans? What can folks who are struggling right now in states to solve these problems, what can they learn from and use to help themselves in this moment?
Yeah, thank you so much for the very directed question, Corey. I was kind of missing that in there. But yeah, one of the things that USDR has been working on really hard over the last month is an in-depth comparison of a number of these vendors that we are intending to publish next week, actually, so that people can understand what is it that different vendors are trying to do, what is it that they can provide, and how does that fit into what unemployment agencies need? So when I stop speaking, I'll drop a link into the USDR page where we will add that link next week.
Great, thanks. And something to look out for next week, a little light Thanksgiving reading. So Adam, over to you. I wanted to just kind of keep this thread going for another moment around vendors. We had a few different questions come in touching on these, so I'm going to try and do a bit of a composite question. As you think about this from an overall kind of 30,000 foot federal level, how do these different vendors factor in to the process and accountability of this process, and how can we design for the most kind of productive and fruitful experiences as we set a policy path in motion toward implementation to ensure that the vendor piece of it is designed as well as it can be?
That's an excellent question. I think that you know, the key thing here is that, like, and I think this was a highlight of the, you know, something that's repeated frequently in the first panel, is that we're not reinventing the wheel here, right? Like, these processes exist, and these capabilities are out there, they're vetted, they're known. So groups like USDR are familiar with and have assessed, as Alyssa said, releasing next week sort of a list of the vendors that are out there. Within the federal government, I'm less familiar with the vendors themselves, but within the federal government, you know, building on the work that was done around data.gov being stood up in the Obama administration, this year we've seen the stand up of like a Chief Data Officer Council. And we talk a little bit about providing some content to their agenda going into next year in our paper, just to say that, like, you know, this is a group that would be in the forefront of figuring out where these databases across the federal government are holding the information that would help with these identity verification things, and they'd be able to vet those vendors and figure out who's trusted to be able to make data calls against those databases, and figure out that people are who they say they are, and that the benefits that they're entitled to they are in fact entitled to. So I'm sort of skirting the question a little bit, but I think that, like, you know, those are sort of the mechanisms that are already in place that we need to double down on, and we need to. Somebody put in the chat also a reference to Senator Harris's 2019 Digital Services Act. That I mean, that's the type of thinking that we need across the federal government to see that this work is iterative and that you can build on it, and that, like, the foundation that's already been put in place by a lot of hard work and lessons learned from problems, it shouldn't be lost and should be advanced in this space.
Well, and let me pull at this just a bit more. What's the need or role or opportunity for more transparency and accountability and oversight? We're talking about, in even just the unemployment insurance example here, we are talking about an extraordinary amount of funding and an extraordinary amount of lives impacted. So how can we design both the policy and implementation, whether we're talking vendors or the government partners or anyone else, to be set up for the right kind of accountability here?
Mm-hmm. I think Amanda really had the top line for that, her presentation, just to say that what we measure is determines what we do and how our outcomes come or arise. So if we are measuring how those and we're very transparent about how the benefit delivery occurs, who it's occurring to, and where the problems are, we'll be much better able to do it on a beneficiary-centered approach, and we'll be able to see the results in that sense.
Great, thanks. Alberto, I'm going to come back to you. So one thing that the work of the New Practice Lab has really focused on is digging into how some of these systems, benefit systems and unemployment insurance systems specifically, are almost designed to exclude or dissuade certain communities or certain types of individuals from accessing those benefits, primarily communities of color. And I'm curious to hear a bit more about what you've observed in your work at New America, and then how can we avoid that? If we're reimagining a future state for a better way forward on benefits overall or unemployment insurance specifically in this conversation, how can we ensure that systems aren't built purposefully to make it hard for or impossible for some folks who are eligible for those benefits to access them.
Thank you, Corey. Well, there are several horror stories that we've heard when talking to specifically Black and Latino communities. There's things from people having to log on from their cell phones on several occasions for the day for a month just to get their information on it. And there's also stories about people not being able to claim because the system was set up in such a way that they got fired but never told, or they even, and this is kind of a sad story, but government systems do a poor job of handling names that don't follow the traditional American convention of first, middle, and last name, or that include characters outside of English, the alphabet. That leads to names being misprinted on social security cards, or the same name appearing differently on a credit card, on a school ID, or in the cards that were used to give the people the money. And that ended up in really bad stories of people literally being furloughed, being evicted from their homes. And this is one of the great crises that the US is going to see in the next couple of months. And that could all be solved if we center on the user when we're trying to design those technologies that we're all talking about, both Alyssa and Adam and the previous panel. It's certainly looking at who is going to be using the services. And when I say that, it's not just the common users that we're getting right now, it's also the ones that we are not getting. I mean, we have to say that in 2019, just over 80% of white adults say they owned a desktop or a laptop computer. But if we compare them to the Black adults, it's only 58% and 57% of Latino adults. In broadband access, it's similar. It's 79% for whites, but 66% for Black households and 61% of Latino. So one way to tackle that is literally designing for the 10%. It's a principle that we consider both and I know that this is so Beck Center as well, but it's considering designing the policy for the 10% of the population that is hardest to reach. And when you do that, it's when we serve the most in need. It's when we ensure that the policy will work better for everyone. And in this case, and just taking ideas from the Day One project, and if we are going to build a council, we need to build that council with rules that take the user in the center of every communication that goes in. If we are going to give more money to both federal and state systems, we need to include either rules or procedures that force them to think of all the users that they're trying to reach. And again, this is a country that is rife with racial inequity problems, but we should be thinking about from the onset of any and every public policy design, not just in tech.
Thanks, and I think you took us where I was hoping we would go, which is understanding that we know how to design these systems to be more inclusive and to ensure we are reaching all of the eligible folks. It's just that some places, their cultures value or design differently. And so it sounds like you're saying, Alberto, the way to approach that is to require it or mandate it from a potential federal policy approach, particularly as we see more and more funds being dispersed in the weeks and months ahead. Perhaps there's some sort of accountability or requirements that might tie to a more human-centered approach or user-focused approach in how those systems can be built, which leads us back to how we measure what matters and ensuring that we are set up to truly serve all of the people we hope to serve. We're coming up on time here. I want to ask one last question for the group, which is, we are, and we talked about this a little bit here and there, but we are headed into a new federal administration. We'll have the incoming Biden-Harris administration taking office in January. We know that Senator Kamala Harris had introduced back in 2019 a Digital Services Act, identifying ways to support more public interest technology aspects of this work. We expect to see all sorts of opportunities for day one or other changes on the horizon. What would be the number one thing, if we're focused on unemployment insurance, that you would hope to see at the very start of the Biden-Harris administration? Where do you feel like there's the most promise for potential to hit the ground running? Adam, I'll start with you.
Well, that's exactly what our paper is focused on. And so I think that, an executive order from the president that would essentially direct the Labor Department to make grants to states to increase the prevalence of digital services teams in the unemployment space would be an absolutely critical first move.
Great, thank you. Alberto, I'll come to you next.
Something that we've heard a lot is there is a lot of certainty when the systems are in place and they're looking for fraud. If we could fix that mentality and instead of focusing on lowering fraud and then focusing on helping as much people as we can, that would center a lot of the things and a lot of the conversations around unemployment insurance. Yes, there is going to be fraud. Yes, there are cyber attacks to state systems, but that is one of the main problems when in such cases you've seen 90% of people being inaccurately accused of fraud when getting $600 for unemployment insurance.
Great, thank you. And Alyssa, to you.
Yeah, I'll expand on Alberto's idea of the most important thing is putting the users first, both the claimants of unemployment as well as the employers who are trying their best to give the right information. And in so doing, you're able to, if you're doing the experience right, you're going to solve problems before they even start. And so you want to be thinking about making sure that agencies are able to get through the backlog, because that is a hugely impactful and important thing, but also make sure that as you're changing the system, as you're building it and rebuilding it, you're building it in a more resilient and scalable way that's going to prevent backlogs from accruing in the future.
Great, thank you. And one last comment that came in from the audience, ensuring that as we design this future state of unemployment insurance and any other benefit systems, we want to be sure that we are designing them for maximum accessibility, including for communities and individuals with disabilities. So,
Corey, if I could just jump and just say one thing, like I think that point and Alberto's point, and obviously something that you guys do at Beck, the idea of designing for the hardest 10% to reach is just so critical here. And to pull the aperture out just a little, the other idea in our paper is on the creation of a U.S. Future of Work Commission that would take a lot of the lessons learned out of an experience like this and take an understanding of this user-centered approach to dealing with a lot of these problems that, as we've said about unemployment insurance, exist in the rest of the work issues, right? Whether it's AI or automation or other things, that like we need a new system. We have a New Deal system of labor and employer-employee relationships in this country in terms of regulatory structure in a 21st century that doesn't resemble that in so many ways. And we need a new plan to deal with that. And we need to take these ideas and put them into that sort of larger discussion.
Thanks, Adam. And again, that paper was shared in the chat, and we hope folks will give it a look. As we close out today, I just wanted to give a big thanks to Adam, Alberto, and Alyssa for joining us for the second half of our discussion focusing on unemployment insurance. And one thing we know, whether it's unemployment or anything else, is that, and we heard this again and again today, it's not the shiny new technology that solves problems. It is the people, the practitioners, the workers, the communities, the organizations. And through our work at the Beck Center, we know it is critical to continue building the capacity of the field to drive toward the better outcomes we're hoping for. So if I can give a shameless plug, we've just launched a survey at the Beck Center to better understand the evolving and growing field of public interest technology, very broadly defined, and anyone who identifies as working in that field. So I'm going to drop that into the chat. And I hope that if you identify as working in public interest technology, or you know folks who do, you'll take the survey. It's only about 10 minutes. And share it out to your community. So I'll drop that in, and just wanted to say thanks again to New America and the Day One Project for co-hosting this event with us at the Beck Center. And I'll send it back to you, to Micah, to close us out. Thank you.
Corey spoke about the people that solve these problems, and Corey, Adam, Alyssa, all of you, Alberto, you are the people solving these problems. It is such a privilege and a pleasure to have had you with us today, and the other amazing panelists and speakers that have participated in this event. We are very grateful to all of you, but we are most importantly grateful to our participants. The efficacy of this conversation has very little to do with what we say here today. It has everything to do with what those of you who were listening do on the other side of this discussion. So we look forward to working with you in the weeks and months ahead. There were an abundance of questions. We're sorry that time did not permit us to answer all of them, but please engage with us, engage with Corey and her team at the Beck Center and the other organizations that participated today. Together, we can solve these challenges. Together, we will solve these challenges. And we're excited to work with you in the months and years ahead to make that happen. Bye-bye.